Ionio.
Yeah,
Okay.
not
Ionio. Got
yeah.
it.
Yeah,
Stretch
yeah, and
the I.
yeah,
Ionio.
yeah. And if you mess it up, it's fine. It's not a problem. Okay, awesome, cool. So let us jump right into it. Ryan, thank you so much for hopping on. And I I would just let you start. Just tell us a little bit about what you do, who you are, how we met, what's the story.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name is Ryan. My background is as a corporate lawyer. I'm based in Los Angeles, California. Spent years practicing in mergers and acquisitions and emerging growth, which essentially means I was helping all kinds of different companies with their really transformative deals and transactions. I did that for a number of years until I thought I saw a pretty significant problem in the day-to-day work of drafting and negotiating contracts. I started thinking about a potential solution, ultimately left my job as a corporate lawyer to really go very deep into the world of legal tech, figure out what's working, what's not working, what customer pain points tend to be. And then I got into the journey of really starting to ideate and wanting to build the product that has now turned into Standard Draft.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about Standard Draft as a product right now, what it does?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe just kind of going back to the problem that I observed, I always thought there was a real lack of standardization and structure in drafting and negotiating contracts. The way it typically works for most people and most companies is that you have a debate around which side's template to use. There's really no standardization around how to draft certain kinds of contract sections and things like that. And I thought there's a possible way to use both standardized content and technology to solve that problem. So that's essentially what Standard Draft does. So Standard Draft is a platform designed to accelerate the process of drafting and negotiating contracts between companies. And I would say what's somewhat unique about Standard Draft is the platform is a bridge between both sides. It's not just for this side of the contract or that side of the contract. It's a bridge so that one side can propose a contract and then both sides will have this very modular and seamless experience to draft and negotiate it. So you can click to include a certain section, the other side can see that, make a decision as to whether or not they agree with it, and turn it into a much more structured and accelerated workflow.
Makes sense. That's a beautiful description of what we have been working on. Yeah. And what was the timeline like from inception to be here right now with and I'll just let you explain where we are at right now and what was the timeline like as well.
Yeah, so there's certain amorphous elements to this timeline because this is an idea that's been playing around in my head for many years now. As you know, I kind of had my late nights and early mornings as a busy corporate lawyer. I would say where the timeline became a little bit more active, for lack of a better word, was back was last year. So in 2022. I had left my law firm. I was doing some consulting work in the legal tech space. I was really trying to figure out the lay of the land. And that's when, on my end, I was taking it a little bit further down the idea maze of trying to figure out how is it that I'm going to solve this problem and what does this product need to entail. In that journey is when I got connected to you, Rohan, and your team as I was still, trying to take this slightly fuzzy idea with an impression of the problem and the space and the domain and kind of translate it to something else. So yeah, that happened last year.
Last year. Okay, perfect. And when you had the idea to build a software platform, a SaaS platform, you might have thought about the approaches to build it. So you have, partnered up with a CTO to build something. You have outsourced it. Then under outsourcing, you have outsource, and then you have outsource in the state, in the US. So what were some of the ideas that you were playing around with, and how did you what were the parameters you were gauging the idea on? No, not the idea, I mean
Yeah.
the idea of building it on. Because
Yeah. So I would say like the most important goal from my perspective throughout that consideration period of how to build it was what is going to be the most lean and expedited way to build this product, but nonetheless build it in a way that's legitimate. The audience that I was hoping to serve, lawyers, they're not very forgiving. It's not like a consumer product where perhaps if the MVP is really shaky, they can still give you another chance. With a lawyer as the target user, you need to have a pretty legitimate product. So I would say that was kind of the framework of my choice. I want to be lean. I want to take this idea from up here and get it into a product where I can really test this thing and see if there's something worth pursuing here, but wanting to still do it in a legitimate way, right? In terms of the various options you just described, I was definitely thinking through all of them. I would say one that I spent quite a bit of time, frankly, experimenting with, and this is where I was trying to, teach myself and see if I can do a thing or two, was in the low code, no code space, which I would say was probably quite a bit hotter last year than it is these days when, AI has now kind of come in and stolen the show a little bit. But, I experimented with low code, no code, things like Bubble for a while. I thought about, various outsourced ways to build it. Um, and so that was kind of the spectrum of my decision making. But let me know if you want me to go even deeper as to kind of factors and things like that.
Yeah, so just out of curiosity, I remember we had talked about this. I think now this is 1.5 years ago, but there was a point where we had talked about, hey, could we do this with low code? And you were also speaking with low code specialists at that time, and now you are here. So what, like, do you think it would have been possible? What are your impressions of your own past self with the no code idea?
Yeah, so I think with low code, no code, as a founder, and particularly as a non-technical founder, you need to gain some real clarity around what is the type of MVP, what is the type of version one of your product that allows you to try to test, experiment, and dare I say, even validate in a meaningful way. And I think at the time, I didn't really have the clarity of what it was going to take to do that. So that's why I spent a number of my own cycles kind of going with low code, no code, speaking with agencies, but also trying to teach myself, is because, I just wanted to move. I just wanted to get into action. What I ultimately realized, and what my current self knows that I wish myself at the beginning of that journey knew, was that for the type of product that I think I ultimately needed to really test what I want to do with standard draft, low code, no code just wasn't quite going to cut it. Or maybe more importantly, if I was going to go low code, no code to do what I wanted it to do, there's going to be so much custom code that would still have to be layered on top of it, that it's then one of those silly things of, well, why not just do it the legitimate way the whole way, instead of trying to back into these low code, no code frameworks. So I'd say that those were the couple most important aspects of it for
Yes,
my story.
makes sense. And as we build the SaaSes, we typically have this. I think we have a three-stage way of building them. So first we have the road mapping and deciding what to build. Then we have the actual building, and then we have the iteration, maintenance, and adding features, stuff like that. So I think before jumping into the road mapping stage, did you have an idea that, hey, this is what we needed to do? What were some of the approaches that you were trying out yourself? And then how did you make a decision of working with someone else to do that wireframing and road mapping? How did you come to that decision or that thought process?
Yeah, so I think for the wireframing and road mapping, maybe one thing that's important for someone to consider is the extent of domain expertise you bring in as a founder, right? So I would say the decision making around wireframing looks very different for someone who has a keen insight or appreciation for the problem they're trying to solve, the users they're trying to build for. And I think thankfully I brought that into this product. So I would say I had some sense of clarity around the problem that I wanted to solve and what at a basic level the product needed to do. So for example, I knew that lawyers want to be able to see the full text of the contract when they're making their different drafting and negotiating decisions. That's maybe the kind of insight where someone who's not a lawyer, it's not intuitive. Someone might think, oh, actually it should just be an easy questionnaire, but I knew no, like lawyers need to see that, right? So there were some basic things like that I was already starting to bring into the wireframe. And
Yeah,
maybe it wasn't in Figma and it was more in like Google Drawings and just my own hand drawings. But so I was having, some sense of vision around the key things I needed to do. I think what I lacked was then any kind of real deep appreciation for like typical UI, UX, things that you want to do in a product and things to avoid. And that's where, getting into that wireframing journey in a bit more of a serious way with you and your team was very helpful for me at that stage of the process.
Makes sense. So we did the wireframes and then we did the UI UX mockups as well. And in this stage, we had a high level. So we did the wireframes, the UI UX mockups, and then also we did something called a micro POC, which we will touch on in a bit. But for all of this, and for the first, for the preliminary stages, we we had a timeline in mind, which was I think like a 3 or 4 week timeline, right? That was the timeline that we had in mind. And then in practice, it took us way longer. So can you talk a little bit about what were some of the nuances we missed? Why did it take so long? And what was your impression before starting it? And when we were done with it, what were you thinking? Like, okay, so what was that story then?
Yeah, so I think you typically hear that when it comes to development, any phase of it, any timeline you have in your head, apply a multiplier to it, right? And this is my first rodeo with this kind of software product development, and it's absolutely the case that estimates that you have from the outset maybe don't end up being true by the time that you're done. So here's where I learned some important lessons, right? I think it is easy to fall into the trap of just getting maybe a core wireframe or UI UX mockup on paper for a certain feature or workflow of your product, but then not go those extra steps of really thinking about that end to end, all the little details of it, right? So as part of the standard draft product, we had this negotiation phase where I can send a contract to Rohan, Rohan can review it, mark different things, send it back to me. So when you think about that broadly, you don't then appreciate all of these little nuances. What happens if Rohan wants to add a viewer on his side? What happens if Rohan sent it to Ryan, but then wants to get it back because he wants to make another change? And those are the kinds of things where I think when we're trying to put our 3 or 4 week estimate, or when we're in the early stage, we didn't realize how deep each of these things can go. And then once we got into it, for certain things, we went very deep. For certain things, we went slightly deep, but even with that, it ended up, taking longer than we anticipated. And then where that kind of comes back is then when you go to build the product, the areas where you went really deep, okay,
Yes.
well, maybe took a while, but it definitely helps in that build stage. And then the areas where you didn't go so deep, well, now you're having to think about that as you're building the product. So, I don't know that there's ever quite a silver bullet, but I think the idea here is probably, as the founder coming into this, you really want to think about just every little point of that journey and don't think that a single wireframe automatically maps onto all of that. I think that was the big thing that I learned.
Makes sense. And when we say think about all of the different bits of that journey, we literally mean all of the different bits. So in standard drafts end, maybe we can just put a screenshot here, but in the standard drafts end, we have this contract composer, the contract creator on the left side. And you are selecting options in it. And every time you select an option, the color of a button changes. And that change is reflected on the right side. And there are 3 levels of colors. And there are 3 levels of changes. And when we were in the wireframing stage, I think we did about 80% of them, the colors and changes and all of that. And then when we were building it, we are like, man, we forgot about the 15% to 20% of the colors. And yeah, so that is something I noticed as well. And one more interesting thing is everything we had skimmed over in the wireframing stage, it came back with a multiplier. It was, I think, twice as more time consuming to get it wireframed and built when we were actually developing it. That was an interesting realization as well. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're saying something, continue.
No, I'm saying I think it's just one of those human nature things. Like I think it's true in software development as true as it is in law, right? So in law, we normally would have a term sheet or a letter of intent, which is meant to be this like summary of the key points of a negotiation or a contract. But no one ever wants to go all the way deep on something like that because people lose energy or people don't want to fight so much at that early stage. So people are always like, okay, this we can deal with later. But to your point, Rohan, those are things that always come back with quite a bit of bite and end up being a multiplier. So yeah, I just think having the patience to want to go deep from the outset is super important.
Makes sense. And one of the things we as a company are proud of is the fact that we we don't go over budget. I mean, we don't go over budget. We always have a fixed price build, and that is how the road mapping was done as well. And I think that might have been one of the reasons you decided to work with us as well. So can you talk a little bit about how that or any other aspects of our service were attractive and that made us attractive to work with?
Totally. So I think maybe it's important again for me to note that I was coming into this, and this was going to be my first time doing something like this, right? The journey of developing product and things like that. So for me, since I was coming into it pretty blind as to how long it might take or what the impact could be if things aren't going on the timeline that was predicted, it became very important from the beginning for me to have some structure, clarity, confidence around, to some extent, timeline, although I knew timeline was always going to be somewhat fuzzy by nature because you can never fully predict things, but certainly with respect to cost, right? And so that's where there's a pretty profound difference between an engagement where you're going hourly versus an engagement that is kind of based on the scope of the project, right? And I definitely wanted something that was based on the scope of the project because I knew it was going to be tougher for me to understand, okay, here's what we need to accomplish for this feature. Since I've done it a few times before, I know this should take 20 hours. I didn't bring that level of expertise into it. So that's why kind of that project-based approach was very important to me. It's obviously something that, we discussed at length and found the right way to move forward on that basis. But yeah, in terms of my overall decision-making, that was a pretty important factor.
Makes sense. And you would have probably explored. So when we are talking about outsourced agencies, right, all of them are on a spectrum. So you have the Upwork outsourced agencies, which are really, really outsourced Upwork agencies. And then you have the typical bigger agencies, which are in India, Ukraine, EU, all of that, which are slightly bigger than us. And when we started working together, I think it was me, Pranav, and I think 3 or 4 devs. So we are a pretty small team, and you were interacting with me and Pranav for a lot of the road mapping stage. And so I just rambled on, but the question I was trying to ask is, how did you decide that, hey, these were the outsourced devs I was going to work with? How did you make that decision from our first?
Yeah. So I would say probably one of the really big things that stood out even from those early days is I was doing similar calls with others as well. And I think I gained a pretty quick realization of what kinds of teams come into projects like this in a real mercenary fashion. Like they kind of want, the project, they want a lot of clarity around it. They want to understand what the steps of it are, and their willingness to engage in something on that project basis is really dependent on having all of that structure around it, right? What I appreciated about even the early calls with you and Pranav is it was less about, even trying to think about like the little steps, and it was more about you guys understanding the product. Like, hey, Ryan, like, tell us more about this problem you're trying to solve. Like, yeah, we've dealt with a contractor too. We think we understand it, but can you tell us more? So you guys brought in a willingness to not just kind of go in and start coding and building, but really trying to gain like a deep appreciation of what are we all trying to do here? Because I think I realized from your guys' perspective that you guys are, smart and interested in things like this, but it also makes sense for you guys and what you're doing to work with clients and projects that have a real legitimate shot at becoming something. So that was one thing that definitely stood out from our early calls, was your guys' willingness to engage, ask the right questions, push back in healthy ways to various points that I maybe hadn't thought hard enough in terms of the development angle. So that was probably that was one of the really big factors. And then just gaining a level of confidence in your guys' technical abilities. And I have a feeling maybe we're going to move here in your questions as well. But going through kind of that micro proof of concept phase so that I can gain that extra level of conviction where it's not just these guys might sound good on a call, like let's see where it translates. Your guys' willingness to do that alongside me also really helped the journey overall.
So that, I think, honestly was Pranav, and I think that was towards the end of the road mapping stage. I think back then, about 1.5 years ago or so, we weren't really doing the micro POCs, and yours was one of the first engagements where we were like, we have architected out everything. We have done all of the wireframes. We have done all of the UI UX mockups, but there isn't anything moving. There isn't anything moving, clickable. That would be a representative of the real software done. So that is when Pranav built it. So the credit there goes to him. Can you talk a little bit about not just the micro POC, but after we built the micro POC, you went out and you did a full survey or review of it along with someone technical. So can you talk a little bit about that as well? How what the micro POC did, then your experience of getting this stuff evaluated, everything we had done so far from another expert, and the story behind that as well.
Yeah, so I think, one interesting thing to note about the timeline broadly here is, every, I think, startup and founder story is somewhat unique. And in my case, there was a while where things were pretty amorphous, where I was digging in really deep, but then realizing, you know what, I need to go talk to more users and potential customers and figure out that there's something here. And as things became slightly more mature with each step of the journey, like, all right, now there are wireframes. Now this is kind of a different kind of conversation I can have. Okay, now there's this micro proof of concept version. Now this is a different conversation. So as we talk about timelines, I think it's important to note that the overall journey, there's kind of been these episodes of going away, coming back, going away, coming back, right? Here are the couple things that are really important to me. First, and I'll be transparent about this. I would say, despite the level of polish from you guys that I was feeling on our calls as we were going through the wireframing, that meant very little in terms of the confidence I could have relating to building product, right? So you guys were able to tell me about projects you've worked on in the past, things like that. But even just seeing us translate some early wireframes to a micro proof of concept allowed me to see, like, you guys have needed to start thinking through some of the more complex bits of standard draft. So for standard draft, that was getting the right sort of editing tool for the content, the contract, right? Starting to think about a workflow that can get into that negotiation. That's when we started exploring like these JSON frameworks and things like that. So part of it was just, I needed to become more confident in you guys being totally transparent. And that was micro POC became one vehicle to do that. The other important thing was, even if I became confident in your guys' ability to build a product that I could interact with, I then didn't bring the expertise to get confident on everything that was going on behind the curtain, right? As a non-technical founder, I can't dive into GitHub and be like, oh yeah, these guys are building this in a really scalable way and they're using, the right approaches. So that's when I then kind of hit the pause button again and went out on my side to find kind of the right technical expertise for the standard draft team to work alongside your team, so that not only can we build this, but we can build this in a way where I have a bit more assurance that this is scalable, this is being done the right way, and we're being mindful of all the things that will be important for this product, like data privacy, security, things like that. And we're architecting this in a way that allows it to grow. So yeah, that's when on my end, I kind of went out to find the right, technical person to help alongside me over on the standard draft side.
So perfect. And what was their impression on what was their impression on the decisions that were being proposed on the technical side? Like, what did they say about what we were doing when you had that expert on you?
Yeah, so I think it stood out as a sophisticated and logical way of approaching this. I think what was immediately appreciated was that you guys weren't trying to go with some funky, languages or tech stacks to build this out. In fact, I think it was very important to you guys to try to do this in a more traditional way, so that you could empower me on my side to go in and bring additional talent down the road or do whatever else I needed to do to keep building this thing, right? So I think that was a very early, easy, all right, check the box. They're doing it the way I would have expected at this basic level. But then when it comes to the more like nuanced things that really relate more closely to standard draft product, what I tried to do is I tried to have someone come in and almost spend a little bit of time just thinking through how they would do it, instead of just seeing how you guys did do it. And then after they would do that, I would try to see, okay, now how do they map it on to how the Ionio team has kind of gone about this? And yeah, I would say for the most part, your guys' approach was really sharp and people were able to gain confidence that like, yeah, this actually is a really smart way to go out and build this. And that gave me more confidence to really start the build with you guys.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah. Interesting. So the next part of the SaaS development process was the actual coding. And before we started with the coding, after we were done with the wireframes, we had like a month, 2 month long break. I'm not really clear on that. We had a break, and then you went out, you did some research, you talked to some early users, and then we started building the product. So in that phase, what were some of the things you were still unsure of? I mean, when you're making a big decision to devote like the next years of your life to something, that's a very difficult decision. Now you're basically trying to pick a spouse on that on that journey. So what were some of the things you were worried about in the development, as you had the standard draft technical team work on it as well as the Ionio team work on it? So what were you like fuzzy about, not scared, worried about, and what were those things that you were worried about back then?
Yeah, so I think we kind of talked about some of those factors as it relates to kind of working with the Ionio team and becoming confident in it, right? Another set of really important factors in all of this is gaining conviction in the idea and what we're building, right? So yes, I brought in kind of the domain expertise and I had an impression of the problem, but I definitely wanted to gut check things whenever possible. And again, there are wireframes now. Now there's a micro POC. Now there are even better wireframes. Those gave me those moments to go and do some more gut checking. So I'd say those were probably just as important as the gaining more clarity around working with you and your team and how you guys were going to work with the standard draft team to build this. So I would say that was the reason for kind of like the timeline in the early days before we could get into just like writing code. The other thing for me that was related to this is how much code is the right code is one way of putting it, right? So even once we had the wireframes and things like that, to what extent did we need to go out and build this product for me to take it to initial customers and users? That was another thing that I was trying to take my time to weigh before we just got into code mode. And the point of advice I would have here for maybe like a past self and anyone that's considering like working with you is it really is important to try to gain as much of that clarity early on as possible. Because once you get into development mode, now you're just kind of on that treadmill. And in some ways it feels good because it feels like you're advancing, right? Like more is being built, more is being built, more is being built. But you need to have a real level of confidence that this is how much we need to build to go out and do some meaningful things in terms of user testing and stuff like that. So I would say those were the main core reasons I was kind of taking my time before we got into writing that first line of code, so to speak.
Makes sense. And so those were the reasons we took the time. You took the time off basically. What were some of the things you were worried about before starting to work together? With these guys would not be good here, this would fail. What were some of those challenges that you were personally worried about before the engagement?
So like I said, I think the two flavors of it. I've talked about the potential worry around working with you and your team, and there I was able to quell any concerns from doing the wireframes with you and the micro proof of concept. So that means we already had a working relationship going. We were getting on calls. I was able to feel that out. Then I got more confident when I was bringing in kind of the right technical people on my side to vet what it is that you had done up to this point and to also vet what the roadmap was looking moving forward. So I kind of gained my confidence there. Really, I think the lagging timeline for some of that was more so about me going out and trying to vet the concept a bit more. And that's one of those really tough things for a founder, right? Like, how confident do you try to get before you like take the leap of faith? And I think I always had this like, I always had this outlook that once you start writing the code, now you're doing the thing, right? And so I just wanted to get as confident as possible before writing that first line of code, I guess. So that was the reason for kind of those steps of the journey.
Yeah, of course. Makes sense. We started the development. We started the coding, and then we were working with the standard draft team as well. And what was that like? Because there is a big time difference, there is a cultural difference, that there hypothetically might be a language difference, but since we are talking right now, there is not. But there were a lot of fundamental differences between the Indian team and the team based in the US. And how were you as a founder working through all of them? What was your experience like through that?
Yeah, so certainly I think going through that wireframing and micro proof of concept was helpful on some of those fronts, right? So trying to feel out what the working relationship was going to look like asynchronously. So how do we work together when we're on a Slack channel, when we're sending emails or messages or things like that? Part of it was getting on calls, right, with you and Pranav, and kind of testing things out on that basis. So there was some of that we were able to do without taking our leap into the really meaningful like product development stage of the journey, right? So I was able to kind of gain some confidence there. So things like language, even time and stuff like that, I was able to get a better sense of. So like for example, even when we're working on the proof of concept, and as I was thinking about time differences, I was like, all right, so here are kind of like the hours on the morning for me or in the evening that kind of map onto when I could get on calls. And then here's kind of the stuff that I can do to give some guidance or feedback to the Ionio team. So then during the night when I'm asleep, things can move forward. I wake up, can engage with the team a little bit in those hours. And so that's where I was able to see like, okay, this can work. And I think I also recognize on your guys' end where yes, you're not totally changing your schedules and being awake all night and sleeping all day to map onto my timing. But certainly there was more than enough hours during my morning time, even being Pacific time in the US, where you guys were still staying awake a little bit deeper into your night, where we could kind of engage and get into discussions on Slack and things like that. So I'd say kind of just at a working relationship level, those were the things that stood out.
Makes sense. And as we were, let me think. As we were, there is nothing really to talk about much in the coding phase because it's like we're basically just coding. So we were just like coding. There's nothing there. But after we were done with the coding, towards the end of the first initial MVP engagement, we had a large patch of time where you were going out to users and you used to onboard someone on, and the app worked 90% of the times, and then it didn't work sometimes. And then we would try to fix it, and then you would come back, and then you would test it again with more users. So what was that experience like after the MVP was built and you had to go out and we were just wrapping things up? What was that like?
Yeah, so the way you described it is essentially kind of what the process looked like. So with the product we were trying to build, I knew I never wanted to kind of do like the full public release right from day one for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons was really kind of battle testing the product, not just in terms of like whether it works and usability, but seeing how users were interacting with it. Did we make the right choices in terms of UI, UX, and things like that? So during that leg of the journey, there were certain features, there were certain bugs that would come up, and then we would get on it and we would try to fix. There were other things where I was able to see like, all right, here's how users are interacting with this product in a way that I wouldn't have predicted, which then informed other things that I knew I wanted to work on in the future. So those were the main points of it. What I appreciated certainly was that you and your team didn't disappear into the abyss once I got to that stage. It wasn't as though once we had to deal with some bugs or things like that, I was left out in the cold. So yeah, we were able to kind of continue the working relationship from there, and there were some points that you guys were able to act really quickly on because I expressed to you, hey, this is really important. Like the application isn't doing X, Y, or Z, which is very important to these few users. We need to get on top of this. And you guys were able to get on top of those and resolve them where possible.
Yeah. And just to like add specifics here from our team, Dinkar has been like very, very instrumental in building a lot of the technical bits of it. Dinkar, Pranav, Jatin, just shout out to all of them. So they have been really fundamental to this. And he was many a times the one who was staying up and pushing these fixes or testing it out. So just shout out to him. Yep.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's cool. Perfect. So wireframes done, roadmap done, development done, we deployed it. Um, yeah, I think that is pretty much it from my end. Is there anything else that you would like to share? Is there anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, I think, one thing that I already mentioned, but I was really just focused on like the early stages of our engagement was your guys' willingness, or not your guys' willingness, but your guys' ability to not just feel or be like a mercenary, right? But that wasn't just true at the very beginning.
Yeah.
That has remained true throughout the journey. And I think that's really important, right? So even once we did make the big decision of, all right, let's work together to build the product, it's not as though all of a sudden then you guys transformed into a different kind of partner. You guys were still wanting to go deep,
Yeah.
understand the problem space. Once I got the product out, we were having long conversations around here's the user experience, here's the problem we now need to solve. And so I didn't always have to come into those conversations being like, here are the directives of what we need to do. Those we were able to have conversations. And so that is, I know, one thing I already mentioned about the really early stage of our journey, but it remains true today, right? So with our weekly calls and things like that, I just appreciated that it felt like there are these partners around the table with me, not just people that are carrying out discrete tasks. So I would say that that's super important. And I think it's important for anyone, but particularly someone like me as a first-time founder, a non-technical founder, having that kind of partnership around the table to build this product has been instrumental.
Makes sense. Ryan, that is pretty much it from my end. It has always been a pleasure working with you. I look forward to doing that as well. Thank you so much for hopping on and chatting with me for like 45 minutes straight. So thank you so much for that. It was a great call. That's pretty much it.
Awesome. Thank you so much to you and your team for everything. Really appreciate it.
You too. Thanks. Awesome. I'll just cut it out here.